Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. My name is Daniel Vincent, here with my co-host Sean Cheatham. You can find us on other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And we have a special guest with us today. We have Dr. Jim Renihan coming from Mansfield, Texas, president of International Reformed Baptist Seminary, where that is also stationed out there. But Dr. Renihan, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much, brothers. It's good to see you again.
Yes, same here. Same here. And we're here to talk about your new book, or one of your new books. You have a couple that just came out. To the Judicious and Impartial Reader, this is your new commentary on the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith, published by Founders Ministries, Founders Press. Very thick and heavy, weighty book, and I guess in more ways than one. But I guess to kind of start off our conversation around your work at the seminary. Do you have any specific updates that you'd like to provide on your work surrounding that?
Sure. We're very encouraged with the way that the work is going. We've seen a constant increase in students from around the world. We're really happy for that. I will be leaving, God willing, the end of the week to go to Australia, New Zealand, and to offer some classes that we will be doing there. We also, Dr. Barcelos will be in the United Kingdom I think it's in August, to teach a class at IRBS UK. So we're really thankful to God for what He has done and the way that He is increasing our opportunities to see men trained for gospel ministry.
And I guess you're really putting the International Reformed Baptist Seminary. So are you looking in specific regions, or are you really trying to go as far as possible with the reaches of the seminary?
Well, we want to be honest with the name and really be international. But at this point, our focus of attention really is on English-speaking countries. We do have an agreement with some brothers in French-speaking Quebec, Canada. But the focus of our attention is on countries that speak English. I just came back from Latin America and was in 3 different countries there, and expect to go back again in October. But for the most part, and what we're doing is focused on places that speak English right now.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll definitely keep you and your brothers in prayer as you are doing that important work. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
But pivoting now into your book. So this is kind of your second exposition. You did one on the first London Baptist Confession of Faith, and then now you're doing the second. Did this work flow out of kind of the first, or did you have a plan to do multiple editions of particular Baptist works?
Yeah, that's a good question, because actually this is the primary book. And I've been lecturing on the Confession of Faith for about 25 years now, both at IRBS and then at different places over those years. And a lot of people asked me if I would be willing to put my lectures into print. So that's been in the process for a long time, to what I call prosify my lectures. But when I began to work on that seriously, I realized that I really wanted to put it in a sequence and deal with the first London Confession prior to the second London Confession. In some ways, that's how my Symbolics lectures are structured. Early on, we deal with the first London Confession of Faith, and then get into the second. But I wanted to follow that same type of pattern, although to a large degree, most of the work that I had done was already completed on Second London. So in a sense, it came first, although it was written second.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's kind of like you're trying to go through these different particular Baptist writings, especially the confessional aspects of it, and really hit those home. And I know that you've used the term before that, we have these 3 forms of unity with particular Baptist works. And I think it is the first London Baptist, the Second London, and then was it the Orthodox Catechism? Was the third?
No, it's the Baptist Catechism.
Oh, the Baptist Catechism. Okay.
Right. Yeah. IRBS has actually adopted the three as our guiding documents. With if there were to be any conflict that arises between them, the Second London Confession would have priority in our understanding.
Right.
But yeah, we believed that it was appropriate for us to adopt all three. And of course, God willing, there will be a volume 3 which deals with the places, the 18 questions where the Baptist Catechism differs from the Westminster Shorter Catechism. I figure there are several really first-rate contemporary expositions of the Shorter Catechism. You have John Flavel, you have Thomas Vincent, and you have Thomas Watson, and they're all really good. So why try to put all of those questions into their historical and theological context when you have men who are contemporaries who are writing about it? But there are 18 questions where the Baptists differ. And so that's what I want to investigate and write about. So it'll be a relatively brief book, a short book, because it only deals with the 18 questions. But I hope that it will be useful.
That's interesting because I think you and your son Sam have pointed out in kind of your historical overviews that there was so much agreement with the particular Baptists with their Presbyterian and Anglican brethren that it may be focusing on those similarities is almost a moot point. But the real distinctives came when they started talking about baptism, or the structure of the church, the relation of church and state, etc. So that'll be really interesting to see those deviations.
Yeah, I hope it'll be useful.
Now, your book here is has a different emphasis than Brother Sam Waldron's modern exposition of the 1689, in that you delve into a lot of the historical background of what's going on with the language of the confession. Why did you think that was important to do?
Well, in a sense, that was the motivation for the doctoral work that I did back in the 1990s. I came through, was pastor of a Reformed Baptist church beginning in 1984, and we had a confession of faith, but we didn't know the names of very many of the men who had adopted it. Apart from that listing that you always see, there were names there, but we didn't know really much of who they were, besides maybe Benjamin Keach or William Kiffin, but beyond them, we didn't know. Likewise, we didn't know anything about any of the churches that adopted the Confession of Faith. We didn't know where it came from, who were the editors, why it was put forward. And I always felt like that was lacking in my own understanding, and perhaps in many of my brother pastors as well. And I thought that it would be good for us to be able to learn some things about the men and their churches and the theological context out of which the confession comes. So when I did my doctoral work, of course, it was on the doctrine of the church, and that was the book Edification and Beauty that came out of that. That was my PhD dissertation. And then as I taught the symbolics class, I realized that what I had done for ecclesiology ought to be done for the rest of the Confession of Faith. So my lectures focused on that. Where does the confession differ from its source documents, being the Westminster Confession and the Savoy? Why did the Baptists differ? And then how do they reflect commonalities? When the language is the same, why is it the same? And what are they confessing? So it seemed to me that we needed some context, we needed some history, we needed some understanding of the confession. It's really easy, and I did this as well when I in my younger days. It's really easy to read older documents and interpret them as if they were written 10 years ago. And we forget that language changes over time, and even that theology develops. I'll give you an example. The categories that we use for eschatology, premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, pre-tribulational, those are not really historical categories. They're recent 20th century categories. But it's very easy to read them back into the history of the church and interpret old documents as if they promoted premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism, when there may be similarities between various aspects of those positions, but they're not identical to the way that they would be expressed today. That's just an example. I think that it could be expanded to many of the chapters of the Confession of Faith. And so I wanted to be able to provide to men an opportunity to see the confession as it was received. You guys were at the Keach conference a couple of years ago. Maybe you remember the illustration that I used when I said, imagine that you're a member of one of the London churches in September 1677, and you hold in your hand the first printed edition of the confession, and you're reading through it. What would be on your mind, and how would you understand it? Not as a 21st century, well-educated theological Christian, but as a Puritan era 17th century church member whose theological education would also have been very fine, because he would have sat through or under the ministry of well-taught Puritan ministers and would have had access to those leather-bound editions of Puritan works that we like to look at when we go to libraries. They're too expensive for us to buy. They were able to go to a bookstore and buy them and own them firsthand. So they had great resources. So my question is, what was on their mind when they read the words of our confession of faith, and how would they have understood it? So I can't be absolutely certain that my interpretation exactly matches that man sitting in his parlor reading the confession in September 1677. But I think that I can come pretty close, and for the most part, I think I probably hit the mark in it. So it's a very different approach. It's not seeing the confession through modern eyes. It's seeing the confession through 17th century eyes.
Yeah, and that's a good point you bring up, because it is easy for us to be very anachronistic in our looking back in history, instead of doing the work to look at the context of why somebody said something that they did, especially because there are certain nuances in our own confession. And you talk about this, like in the place about necessarily contained. What does that mean in chapter 1, paragraph 6? And having that historical context really helps us to, what did they really mean by that? What were they pulling from? Where were they coming from? What was the background of the authors? And all of that stuff can help us to see what was said.
Exactly. Anachronistic is exactly the word to use. Also, there are nuances about the way that our confession of faith alters the language of the earlier documents that are important to take note of. One of the factors that was involved in the publication of the confession was the theological unorthodoxy of a man who had been sent out from London, whose name was Thomas Collier. And Collier was very prominent, and he was identified with particular Baptists, and he actually published some books with the title Confession of Faith in it. And so it seems that the London men were concerned that others on the outside would read Collier and impute his sometimes heretical views to the churches that were quite orthodox. And so some of the changes, the nuances of language, are specifically directed towards the errors of Thomas Collier. In chapter 6, for example, where the language "our first parents" is used, sometimes is criticized. Well, whoever edited the Confession of Faith made a mistake, because Eve is not the federal head of the race. Adam is. So why did they use the language "our first parents," which, by the way, is in Westminster as well? Well, the reason that they did that is because Socinianism, as advocated by someone like Thomas Collier, denied that there's any relationship between us and Adam and the imputation of his sin. Our confession teaches us that his sin is imputed to us by ordinary generation. So it's necessary that Adam and Eve cohabitate and produce children, and that we are ultimately the descendants of that couple. So that the language, our first parents, is not intended in any way to make Eve a co-federal head of the race. It's to counter the Socinian view that says sin, as we know it, is simply imitation. It's a Pelagian view of sin. You're born pure. You're a sinner because you imitate others, not because you have original sin imputed to you. Orthodoxy says no, we are sinners because original sin is imputed to us, and that imputation comes by way of ordinary generation all the way back to Adam and Eve. So it's easily missed in the 21st century, but in the 17th century it was a really important point to make. And so, I uncovered and found things like that I thought were enormously helpful. In fact, the closer that I worked with the text of the confession, the more that I came to appreciate the care with which it was edited. No changes were made by accident. There weren't any things that were left out that were oversights. These men were really sharp scholars, and they worked very hard, and they expressed themselves really well. So we have a great document. Also, we can say it is the final post-Reformation English confession of faith. And in that way, the authors or the editors have the privilege of standing on the shoulders of those who went before. So that the best of English Puritan theology is coalesced into our confession of faith. That's not to say that, that's not a boastful statement to say, well, it's better than Westminster and it's better than Savoy. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that our fathers had the benefit of those who had gone before them and brought their thoughts into our confession of faith. So when you read my book and you're constantly coming across Edward Lee and Francis Chanel and William Ames and John Owen and Thomas Goodwin, it's to say our fathers were very happy to identify with them and to grow in their expression of theology as a result of the reading that they had done.
And you see really this church Catholic mindset of pulling from the universal church. It wasn't, let's come up with something new because, we don't like those Anglicans over there. We're going to, they saw themselves as receiving that tradition of biblical truth all the way down from the early church. There's a retrieval going on, really.
Yeah, that's right. And, well said. And it's an important point to make that there is a Catholicity to the doctrines that are contained in the confession. Indeed, it's Baptist, okay?
Yep.
The covenant theology is a Baptist covenant theology. The ecclesiology is a Baptist ecclesiology. But the rest of it is easily recognizable orthodoxy that crosses all of the boundaries in English Puritanism. And if geographically you cross the English Channel, it would have been recognized by the Dutch, by the Genevans, by all of the Reformed churches in Europe as well.
Now, in preparing for the book or during the actual writing, was there any section that you really deepened your understanding in or changed your mind about what the historical background was for it?
No, not so much. Although, let me give you an answer to that. That change happened for me when I was writing my PhD thesis way back in the 90s and dealing with ecclesiology. I can remember a day, it was a late autumn day in London, one of those typical misty, wet London days, a Saturday. I took the bus from Oxford in and was sitting in the Guildhall Library and reading the Petty France Church book. And something had been troubling me for weeks. I wasn't sure what it was. And all of a sudden it dawned on me what was going on. That is that their ecclesiology was not exactly the ecclesiology that we were practicing in, of course, that was the end of the 20th century. It was the last decade. And it was like everything opened up to me suddenly, that I recognized and I understood what they were about, because I had brought with me my preconceptions and simply expected to find the things that I had been taught and that we had practiced. And I found that they were very different. It took me a while to have that, in a sense, breakthrough, but that happened. So not when I've been writing the book. That happened to me back then. But I would say that I tried to be careful in a lot of areas, and I called in favors from a lot of friends. To write a book on the whole confession means that, in a sense, you're a jack of all trades and a master of none, because you have to deal with 32 different chapters and a whole lot of different doctrines, which means there are other men who have focused their attention on specific issues that can help me to ensure that the way that I express myself in certain chapters is exactly right. And so, chapter 1, I had Dr. Riddle helping me to think through some of the issues there. In chapter 2, I had Dr. Dolezal reading and helping me there. In chapter 5, my former co-elder, Jason Walter, helped me very much. Chapter 6, thinking about the fall of man. One of my former students who had spent a lot of time working on the doctrine of providence, I asked him to read that chapter and help me to express myself well. Of course, when it came to chapter 7, there's a young man that I know fairly well who helped me deal with covenant theology. And then in chapter 8, of Christ the Mediator, I wanted to make sure that I had that one right as well. So actually, I contacted a couple of friends. And there's one guy in the background who really helped me a lot, and that's Richard Barcelos. Just running things by him and asking him questions. So, I appreciate the way that people have thanked me for the book, but in some ways, there are certain places where others have made sure that what I've expressed is proper and correct, and I deeply appreciate that.
Now, kind of along the lines of talking about your development of the book, was there any part of it that, in terms of topic, as you were bringing these things out, that you found particularly difficult to exposit upon or explain historically?
No, I had collected a lot of material over the years, and nothing comes to mind immediately that was so opaque that I couldn't find material to help explain it. I'm sure you guys have looked at the book and you know that I'm constantly going back to the contemporary literature or previous literature, all the way back into the early church at times, where St. Augustine will appear or someone else. And because of the fact that our confession of faith is so carefully orthodox, it was fairly easy to find examples in William Ames or Edward Lee or John Owen or Thomas Goodwin or any of the others to support the point that I was trying to make. So I don't think so, brother.
Okay. No, it's just kind of one of those questions that I guess comes up as you're reading. You're like, I wonder what issues may have been challenging. I guess from the reader's perspective, one thing that I found interesting was the discussion on infant mortality and elect infants, and some of the controversy that surrounded that historically, even among particular Baptists, it seemed, didn't necessarily come to an agreement of what that view was to be. So I found that challenging in my own right to work through historically and theologically and see what, kind of what is the confessional position on that. But that was a very interesting aspect of the book.
Yeah, I tried to be honest when there were places where there could be a spectrum of opinions, and not recognize that there was a spectrum of opinions. I think that's what you have to do. I was trying to give an honest interpretation, and not make it what I think the confession means, but rather fit it into its context, which means sometimes you come across those kind of situations. Go back to eschatology. What was their eschatology? Well, they had different opinions, and I think that's why chapter 31 and chapter 32 are relatively broad in their expression, rather than sometimes what we've grown up with as very specific. If you don't hold this detailed position, then you're outside the bounds. They didn't even think in those terms.
Yeah, they seem to. It was focusing on those orthodox roots, like with eschatology. We believe in the resurrection. We believe Christ is coming again. Maybe how all that works out in the end, we might disagree on, but those orthodox tenets were there. Even with the concept of elect infants, there was God is electing, God is saving, regardless of how that pans out. There is this principle, salvation is in Christ, and God is the one who saves, regardless of what happens. So
Right.
it's like even in most of these disagreements, they seem to always come back to those core Orthodox tenets, regardless.
Yeah.
Now, where can people go to find a copy of the book?
Well, the major distributor is founders.org. I have seen it advertised for sale from Solid Ground Christian Books.
Oh.
And I know that there are some other major booksellers who are in the process of determining whether or not they'll carry it, which I hope they will, but I'm not going to name them right now because I don't know whether or not they will. The first printing sold out in about 2 months.
Wow.
Which amazed me. It was more than 2,100 copies that they printed and sold out. And now they're on a second print run. That I'm really thankful for that. That means a lot of people bought the book and hopefully are finding it to be helpful.
Oh, I can say at least for me that I don't remember what it was now, but I did have to look something up and I found it helpful. So,
Good.
Is there anything that we can pray for you specifically for your upcoming work?
Well, I have a very busy summer. Here we are on a Saturday late in June, and I leave on Tuesday, and my email will have a an out of the office reminder that says I won't be back at my desk until late August.
Wow.
Because, I'm going to Australia and New Zealand to teach courses down there. And then we'll be spending some time. My daughter is getting married, so we'll be going up to the Northeast for her wedding, and then be going to Canada to do some speaking in Quebec with the brothers up there. We'll be at Josh Summers Church in Kansas City in early August for a conference. So yeah, pray for safety and travel, for sleep. Crossing the international date line is a challenge, and I have to do it both ways. I'll be down under for about 3 weeks. So I'm not a spring chicken anymore, and I do find that sleep sometimes is the biggest challenge. So pray for that, but pray for God's blessing on the work, and also that I can get volume 3 done. I mean, with all this traveling in the next couple of months, there isn't going to be any writing on that book. So that has to be done probably maybe in the fall, I hope.
Is there any, are you allowed to say when there's a tentative publishing date for volume 3?
I wish that I could give you a tentative writing date for volume 3.
Jumped a little too far ahead.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Renihan, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate the conversation and the fellowship too. It's good to catch up and see what the Lord is doing in these other areas. And we appreciate your work in this area.
Thank you. Greet your pastor for me.
Absolutely.
When you see him tomorrow, and appreciate him and appreciate his work. So
we will.
Thanks for having me on. I am very thankful for this.
You're very welcome, Pastor.
Absolutely.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today, and Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care.